Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, March the 2nd. President Trump says he'll keep striking the Iranian leadership in full force for several days to come. Last night, Keir Starmer announced he would now allow British bases to be used for US attacks from this point onwards, in a move he justified as self-defense.
The United States has requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose. We have taken the decision to accept this request to prevent Iran firing missiles across the region, killing innocent civilians, putting British lives at risk, and hitting countries that have not been involved. The basis of our decision is the collective self-defense of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives. That is in accordance with international law, and we are publishing a summary of our legal advice.
That video message released late last night. Britain gave permission for defensive airstrikes from the joint UK-US bases in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and RAF Fairford, a base in Gloucestershire. In the video addressed to the nation, he said that this was the only way to stop the Iranian threat to destroy the missiles threatening UK and allied interests at source in the storage depots and the missile launchers based in Iran.
Hours after his announcement, the first reports emerged of a drone strike targeting a British base in Cyprus. There were no casualties in the incident at RAF Akrotiri, a base near Limassol.
Officials believe that although the strike was after the Prime Minister's statement was released, it may well have been launched before the video was put out to the public. However, in a response to the attack, the base is temporarily to relocate non-essential staff, the RAF said on Monday. But in the sign of how limited this movement is, it's saying that people in Akrotiri village itself don't need to move. So it's quite a concentrated change around. But the shift in our position about the US using our bases is a very big deal. And the government released a summary of the legal advice overnight. So do you want to just talk a bit about what this means?
Yes, let's try and sum that up. So the position has moved a lot since the assault on Iran started at the weekend. Britain remains opposed to offensive attacks against Iranian targets under international law, so it didn't join the initial wave of those American and Israeli strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader and many others in his regime. But the defensive strikes rely on UN Charter Article 51, and that does allow for a high degree of engagement, and thus, we should say, a high degree of risk as well. Just to run through it briefly, it allows a combatant to degrade enemy capabilities, disrupt ongoing operations, and in doing so, it undoubtedly draws the UK closer into the conflict with those defensive strikes. So some degree of legal somersault is having to be turned here, including, and I do think this is going to play a big role in the days and weeks to come, so I emphasize it, Sam, using Diego Garcia, which playbook has stood up this morning as a usage intended to directly attack Iran's missile capability, according to a senior source talking to my Politico colleagues about that. Now, they're saying that Iran's attack on the UK RAF base in Cyprus has helped that defensive line of argument here, but knowing that everything that we've talked about a lot about the use of that base and the Chagos deal and the UK's tensions with the US about this, what in practice it means is that we are now allowing it to be used as full part of this conflict, and also that UK assets are targets and will be more so.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that the, as it were, definition of defensive was quite as wide as you've just set out and can go to the heart of degrading enemy capabilities, a lot of which, frankly, will have been what the US will have been arguing that they were doing in the early hours of Saturday morning, as well as from here one in. Let's just trot around some of the biggest elements in which this affects the UK government, for this is a domestic political podcast, the government is also drawing up plans for the evacuation of tens of thousands of Britons left standing in Gulf countries as the regional airspace was shut down. A total of 94,000 Britons in Gulf countries have now registered their presence and contact details with the government. Most of this is holidaymakers and passengers passing through the UAE. But interestingly, government officials think that the true figure is almost double that. So twice as many people will end up getting in contact. They think quite what will happen to them is unclear. The UAE is putting up at its own expense everybody who ended up there at quite considerable cost. One plan is to evacuate everyone through Saudi Arabia, a 10-hour drive away, a sort of incredible bus replacement service for the flights that no longer are going to be able to go. But there will be political questions about whether or not there should have been earlier warnings for people in and transiting through that part of the world, because there were signs that some kind of assault was on its way, and whether or not more contingencies should be in place ahead of what happened late on Friday night.
But what an abrupt change of subject this is from Friday, when we were all talking about Labour's defeat in the Gorton and Denton by-election, pushed into third place by the Greens. That's a domestic story and impact that's not going to go away. But today, one story dominates all else. And so that's where we're going to put most of our focus.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to chew over. What this means for stability in the Middle East, the role of the UK and Britain's initial decision not to take part in the US assault or to allow the use of UK joint bases with the US, and that U-turn that Downing Street denies a U-turn because they say circumstances have changed, and the implications that could flow from all of that. And as ever, you are on the move. You're in Berlin this morning, so no better place to give us a sort of big grand takeaway from the last 48 hours. Hit me with it.
Well, indeed. I think the shift of UK position is significant for some of the reasons we've touched on, Sam, and particularly those numbers, as you point out, that big exposure that Britain has in the Gulf states. A lot of people who travel there or have been living there. That's a big factor in calculations. But the bigger question for me that looms over all of this is what Keir Starmer's fundamental view of this conflict is. And therefore, was it right to hang back from the big US-Israel attacks at the weekend, that game changer, headed by President Trump, but very closely in contact and driven in the targeting by Israel and by the government there? And why then did he pivot the involvement so quickly? And you can push the defensive argument pretty hard, but in the end, it does draw you much closer into the conflict, and it means the use of your bases, etc. Now, a lot depends on something that Friedrich Merz, here where I am in Berlin, said very candidly in a press conference, which took a lot of people by surprise here in Germany and has waves beyond it. He said, look, I don't know if this is going to produce a better outcome in Iran, but this moment has been coming. He said he wasn't going to judge or prejudge America, so he was leaving a lot of runway there for Donald Trump. And he said, if it works out and if a rogue state's capabilities are stymied and the aftermath is, broadly speaking, net positive, fine. And I think that is really what Keir Starmer is saying too. The downside is what happens if the aftermath is just too difficult for the US and Israel to contain, and we do get serious and ongoing conflict across the Middle East, and obviously the economic impacts from that. We're already seeing talk of the oil price ratcheting up as a result of that limitation on transport in the Straits of Hormuz. And I think one thing is really interesting, really love to know what you think about this, Sam, this half-in, half-out position that is a criticism that Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage have been making against Keir Starmer when it came to hanging back on being involved in zapping the Iranian leadership and then coming in, if you like, a day late and a dollar short? Or was that a sensible pivot because you could then make an argument that's going to get more political support, that you're coming in to the defense of British assets and Britain's in the region?
I can kind of see why perhaps in number 10 there was pause for thought over the last few days, because what sort of took me by surprise is just how explicit the American government and Donald Trump was in the early hours of this conflict that the goal of this conflict is regime change. But as far as I and every other commentator could possibly see, there was absolutely no plan for regime change beyond taking out the leaders. So it doesn't look as if there was even the kind of plan that was put in place in Venezuela to tap up some of the members of the existing regime and maybe install them with tacit US backing for a limited period. It appears to have been a sort of leap into the unknown with no second, third, and fourth stages to the plan as far as we can see. So you can see that being something that Keir Starmer, who likes his methodical approach to foreign affairs, will have, been unnerved by. And frankly, he is being policed by his own party quite a lot of the time and embarking headlong on a kind of US-led, sort of Israeli-aided assault on a leadership with a sort of destination that is unknown. You can see why that looked like it was too tricky and quite easy, I have to say, for opposition politicians to criticize. But when you're in number 10, you can see why the calculation looks quite complicated. And you'll have just had the legal advice from Richard Herman, the Attorney General, saying that participation is not legal. And so to confront your Attorney General and face him down when you effectively agree with him will also have been a complication. I suppose just to sort of throw things back at you, where does this now leave the UK in a European context? It sounds like you think that the UK and Germany are broadly on the same page. Is Europe more or less united? Is that the sense that you get?
Yes, but with one important wrinkle, and it's this, Sam. The line is pretty much unified joint statement with France and Germany issued shortly before the Starmer video that you mentioned a moment ago. And together they denounced the recklessness of Iran's attacks on targets across the Middle East and a soft pedal on whether it's a great idea or reckless of the US to go after Iran and knock out its leadership in this way. But what is interesting is that Friedrich Merz, the German leader who's going to Washington tomorrow, has said much more explicitly than Starmer that he doesn't think international law as it stands is the best guide to action or restraint in this particular case vis-a-vis the attack on Iran and the hopes that will provide a beneficial regime change of whatever stripe, as you point out. That's a bit vague how that's intended to happen. He says explicitly he's not going to judge the US harshly for the attacks. And he says international law classifications will have little effect on this, especially if they remain largely without consequence. Now, that is a huge breach in the dam of rules established in the old school view of the rules-based order and leaning on international law, and that effectively means on the UN and on its role and guidance. So right now, yes, there is an emerging alliance holding together pretty well. I can't quite imagine Lord Herman warming to international law, so what about that kind of tone that we got from Merz? And it does show that there will be differences, and I think domestic pressures on all three leaders in that E3, so-called France, Germany, and the UK, in the next days and weeks. What do you think?
I mean, that is quite striking. Basically, for international law to be denounced as the emperor with no clothes, that's quite a moment from a big European leader, and has lots of knock-on consequences for everything from migration to how you deal with countries like Russia. So, wow, that I hadn't anticipated, particularly from Germany.
Yeah, quite a lot of cross-German lawyers this morning, I would say.
And there'll be a word in German for that. I just need to bring it back home. The government were going to use this week, and in particular tomorrow's spring statement, to do a victory lap on the good economic news. But, the events of the weekend may suddenly start to upend some of that, because at the core of their good news story was better figures on inflation. Better figures, it has to be said, since the November budget, and the Office for Budget Responsibility are, of course, judging against the November budget, so that matters. But the bombing and instability that follows have prompted a surge in oil prices. A little bit of that has receded, but the trajectory is not good. Brent crude jumped as much as 13%, briefly breaking the $80 a barrel mark, but up from just over $70 a barrel before paring back gains to about half that. A reminder, oil prices go up, but not instantly petrol prices, but it looks inevitable in time, I have to say. And when petrol prices go up, then there's inflation because everything, manufacturing, transportation, and so on, starts to cost more. And that's now, all of this is because, as you mentioned, oil goes through the Straits of Hormuz. Now, that is a stretch of water in the Arabian Gulf between Iran and the UAE. And Iran has already attacked 3 ships, marking the first direct sign of supply being disrupted. And critically, it's not that the danger has increased as much as giant global insurance companies decide that the danger has increased and therefore refuse to insure these great big tankers. You just can't leave port if you don't have insurance. So it's actually firms like Lloyd's of London upon whom quite a lot of the attention about the global oil price is trained. So we will see how that all plays out today. We'll look at the markets as that goes on. But for Rachel Reeves, it is she will have more flattering figures in the OBR, but the knowledge that more tricky decisions down and tricky sort of numbers coming, no doubt, down the track. And she, at the budget, made a massive decision that I don't think's got very much attention, which is to remove all the post-Ukraine era subsidy on petrol prices, the 5 pence per litre. That starts going up on the 1st of September, 1 pence per litre higher from September the 1st, 2 more pence on December the 1st, and 2 more pence on March the 1st, 2027. But, if prices go up in a significant way over the coming weeks and months, and she has to look again at those price rises, then that's a massive black hole in the public finances.
And a massively unpopular move with motorists, if, as you say, she has to ratchet that up even higher off the back of a higher oil price. Let's just run through the domestic reaction, Sam, to what's going on. The Conservatives saying they welcome the use of British bases and making abundantly clear that Kemi may not back the initial offensive by the US and Israel. So that's her calling card, I think, for more popularity, perhaps a bit more FaceTime with Donald Trump. The Liberal Democrats called the US use of bases a slippery slope, although one never knows where a slippery slope is supposed to be slipping to, and called for MPs to be given a vote on the matter. Ed Davey is issuing a statement saying Starmer must not let Trump drag Britain into another prolonged war in the Middle East. So a much more cautious and reluctant tone there from the Lib Dems.
And it's sort of mirrored by parties a little bit further out. Green Party leader Zach Polansky, sort of party leader at the moment after Friday, is saying, why is Keir Starmer utterly incapable of saying no to Donald Trump? The Prime Minister's making us less safe. Did we learn nothing from Iraq? Well, Nigel Farage from Reform UK said last night's decision to allow the US to use our bases was better late than never, adding the Prime Minister is a follower, not a leader. By my tally, for national opposition parties, it's 2 each. 2 on each side of the conflict.
Well hedged for whichever way it goes, to saying, I was right. Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, is on the morning round. There'll be a common statement later. Interesting, isn't it, running through all of this with you, how keen the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary are, I think, on engaging with the Commons as soon as possible, and also the party. Keir Starmer set to talk to the PLP tonight, to Labour backbenchers. Of course, that was already in the diary and would have been a bit of a torture after Gordon and Denton. But Playbook was reporting this morning that the Prime Minister isn't quite backed into a corner in the same way that he was the last time in February when he faced his backbenchers, because all of this puts internal domestic problems and party management into perspective. So there's an expectation, as someone tells my colleagues there, that he'll make the most of his statesman vibes in a moment of geopolitical crisis. I had contact yesterday with some close Starmer supporters, let me put it like that, saying that this was the moment he shows his mettle, and one saying, imagine calling for Angela Rayner to take the helm in a situation like this. I mean, poor Angela, because she hasn't actually said anything yet, but that was something that they, I think, wanted to put down as a marker for the Keir must stay camp.
Oh, meow. I love it. You can see why those who want Keir Starmer to stay will use this moment. The optics at the start of these moments like these often look good for a prime minister. If this turns messy and if this turns into a protracted conflict, I have to say, Anne, then the calculations get redrawn, and those who are banging the drum for Labour values and we'll watch that common statement, and in particular the interventions from backbenchers very closely today, then the kind of political reality is less clearly positive for him. Now, I think politics as normal beyond Iran has a bit on hold today. We're not going to squeeze much else in today on Sky News, that's for certain. There are events by Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, and the Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood is fighting to defend her immigration plans, which came under fire as part of the reason some blame for the defeat in Gorton and Denton, but others reject that. But that's all for another day, specifically tomorrow. Tomorrow is also the spring statement. So a bit of housekeeping. We're bringing you a special bonus episode tomorrow afternoon on what Rachel Reeves said. The government are trying to do this as a low-key affair, but you get huge amounts of very important information from the Office for Budget Responsibility, plus a little bit of gloss from the Chancellor herself. So we're not going to allow that to go unmarked, even if those in government aren't that keen on raising up too much in lights. So it'll be an extra episode in your feeds at 4 or 5 o'clock while you're still in Berlin, but I'm very much in Westminster. I look forward to seeing you then.
Sam talked me into it. What could I tell you? We couldn't have a spring statement without Sam Coates.